G'day everyone and welcome back to the vlog. And I say welcome back like that because it has been a long time since I last did one of these vlogs. I do apologise for the wait if you were really keen hanging out for one, but I've got my new setup going. I can finally screen record, so going over these hands in this vlog should be a lot more interesting than it has been in previous vlogs. Now, it's been about 2 months since I did make a vlog and a lot has gone on in the meantime. Melbourne still on lockdown because of coronavirus. We've actually gone to stage 4 of lockdown, which basically means we have an 8 p.m. curfew and we can't go out the house without a mask. Can't even go out the house if we don't have a good reason to, like shopping or exercise. Every business is still closed pretty much, except super essential stuff. So obviously, emotionally, it's pretty draining to be in this situation, and we do get numerous deaths every day because of coronavirus, so it is a pretty scary situation for all of Melbourne, and definitely does take an emotional toll on not only me, but I'm pretty sure most of the people in the city as well. But on the bright side, I do still have online poker to help be a bit of a distraction to everything going on in my city and the world at the moment. In the past 2 months, I have been playing poker consistently over that time, and it's a shame I didn't record vlogs for what's been going on the past 2 months because it's been a bit of a roller coaster. Where we last left off, I was mixing in shots at 2-5 whilst also grinding 1-2 games. Well, I did eventually, after a few weeks, just move up to 2-5 full time, and unfortunately it didn't quite go well for me. You can go back and check my vlogs where I did have that massive downswing at 2-5, and pretty much the same thing happened again the first week. I did go up to 2-5, which obviously pretty disheartening, and I did decide to go back down to 1-2 after that week. But then I don't know whether it was because I was just so psyched out, or I was just in a bad mental space because of experiencing a downswing when I do go up to 2-5. Downswing actually continued when I went to 1-2. The situation was looking pretty dire until I got a suggestion from my boy at Bad Beat Willie on Instagram. A lot of you guys will know him. He is a massive Instagram poker superstar in Melbourne, but he gave me the hot tip that I shouldn't be playing these 1-2-6 max games because he was grinding these 50-cent $1 9-handed games, and he was actually having a really good win rate as a result of that. If I recall correctly, it was something like 15 big blinds per 100, and if he can make that type of win rate, I mean, I can probably do that too, you know. I'm not necessarily saying I'm a better poker player than Willie, but definitely comparable. And if these games are so soft that you can make like 15 big blinds, you know, as one of the bigger winners in the game, it's definitely something I want to look at, especially considering my modest win rate from 1-2. It was about 3 big blinds per 100. You know, if you're playing like half the stake, but you're making so much more in terms of your win rate, it's going to be higher hourly for me, and definitely looking to try and make some money after going through 2 big downswings. So I did decide to go down to the 50-cent $1 game and playing 9-handed as well. And straight away when I dropped down in stakes, it was some of the softest games I've ever played, and I was pretty stoked to actually build some money back up, particularly after those 2 big downswings. So that's sort of been my main game for the past month or so, just grinding the lower stakes. I'm going to try and get myself back up to the 200 NL 6 max games eventually, but for right now I'm happy making a more comfortable win rate, at least in terms of my dollars, playing the small games. So it's going to be my main game for not only today's vlog, but probably for the foreseeable future. That's what we're going to get into today. We're going to play a session of 50-cent $1 online 9-handed cash. I'm about to open up a few tables. We're going to grind out the session, hopefully playing an A-grade game, looking to avoid some over-aggression and just focus on playing good, solid tag poker, because that's what really makes the most money in these lower stakes games. So I'm going to open up the tables now and get some interesting hands out for you guys. Let's go. Welcome back everyone. It's currently about 5 p.m. here in Melbourne, and I've just wrapped up my second poker session for the day. As you can see here on my brand new screen recording, which I can finally do on my new computer. As you can see here, we did get in a total of 1,511 hands. So I was aiming to do 1,500 hands like I typically do in sessions. So absolutely stoked that I hit that number. And good thing we did put in the volume because we were able to earn a total of 266 on the session, which obviously I'm pretty stoked with that. Something else I'm pretty stoked with as well is that because of this new technology, we're actually going to be able to go back over multiple hands I played across this session. I actually got 9 hands total that I thought were pretty interesting and worthwhile going over. So without any further ado, let's get into those hands. Okay, so first hand, we have Ace King in the cutoff. Pretty nice hand to wake up with first go. The EP player goes ahead and opens it up to 2.5 when the action gets to me. Very easy decision to go ahead and 3-bet here. I make it 7.5. When the action gets back to the EP player, they do throw in the call, so we get to go heads up to a flop of Jack 10 7 Rainbow. Pretty big whiff for us, so when the early position player checks it over to me, I decide to check back here. I do have a bit of showdown value with Ace High, and if I did want to semi-bluff on a board like this, I'll probably rather use a hand like King Queen. I decide to 3-bet with. Not only does it have more equity because it has an open-ended straight draw, but it does have the advantage of when I bet it, I can fold out some of my Ace High hands that my opponent has. I decide to check back the Ace King here. Pretty beautiful turn. We do turn the nuts on the Queen of Spades, putting out backdoor spades. The under the gun player checks it over to us, and now I definitely want to go ahead and bet my nuts for value here. I actually decide to bet pretty big. I bet the size of the pot, 16.5. And the reason for that is I want to use a big sizing on this board in particular because my opponent actually has a lot of strong hands in their range. King Queen, or even like Jack 10, pocket 10s, all those type of hands that they do have in their range, they're going to call a big bet regardless. But they're never going to check raise when we obviously have so many hands of Ace King in our range. So we want to go ahead and bet really big to try and maximize value when our opponent does have a really strong hand, which they have a lot of on this board. So I go ahead and bet the size of the pot. Do think there's some merit to overbetting, but that might be a bit overzealous, and then you might start to get hero folds from certain hands. So I decide to bet the size of the pot, and then I get a call from the opponent. So still heads up to the river, which is the 9 of Spades. A very interesting river, puts out a 4-liner to 8 or a king. So when the under the gun player checks it over to me here, I have a pretty interesting decision in terms of what size I want to bet for value. I don't think if my opponent does have 2 pair of set that they're going to call any size bet. Maybe if I bet like 10 or something ridiculously small, I might get a hero call from those. So really the question is, how much value can I get when my opponent has a king? And ultimately I decide to go ahead and rip it. I decide to overbet, bet 3x the size of the pot to put my opponent all in. And my logic for making this decision is, I think if my opponent does have like a King Queen or maybe a King Jack that made a light call on the turn, they're going to call regardless what size I bet. That was my thinking at the time. In retrospect, I think that's a bit of a mistake. I think betting this large, when I obviously have a lot of combinations of Ace King in my range, it could potentially induce hero folds from a King High type hand, whereas if I bet the size of the pot, I'm probably going to get called by kings anyway, and then I'm really just turning up a lot of value by getting too greedy and betting too much. Having said that, my opponent does fold, so don't get to see what they have, but potentially could have made more value if I used a smaller sizing. There was still a large bet, so a bit disappointed with that one. Okay, next hand we have 7-6 of hearts in the big blind. Fun player in the cutoff goes ahead and opens it up to 2.5, and then a very deep stack in the button calls. So when the action's on me here, we have a pretty interesting decision whether we want to 3-bet or just call here. Ultimately, I decide to just call. The reason for this is if I do go ahead and 3-bet this hand, I'm very confident that the cutoff is going to call with a wide range when I 3-bet, so I just rather raise with a more linear range to get some value, and obviously not going to be folding 7-6 to 2.5 either. Happy to take this pot multi-way with a fun player in the mix, so that's what I do. Then we see a flop, Jack 9-5 with 2 spades. We do have a backdoor flush draw, but obviously not going to lead. I check it over to the pre-flop aggressor, and they bet half pot. Then the deep stack calls as well. Now the action's on me here, and I think this is actually a pretty easy decision to just go ahead and fold this hand. The reason is we do have a gut shot, but even if we hit our gut shot, there's actually a lot of reversed implied odds, just because if either of the opponents has Queen 10, which I honestly think they both have all the offsuit combinations of Queen 10 in their range, like we're just going to massively cooler ourselves. I think I get a bit too tempted in this spot because I do decide to call. I thought there was a lot of implied odds with a fun player in the mix. I do think that if I do hit my gut shot, that the cutoff is going to put in a lot of money with pretty marginal hands, which is going to be good, but I think it's just a bit too dicey when we do lose to Queen 10 if we turn a straight. We don't turn a straight. We do turn a pair though, which is pretty good. I go ahead and check it over to the pre-flop aggressor still, and they keep betting. They go ahead and bet 2/3 the size of the pot. Then the button folds. Now I think this decision is actually a call, and the reason I like calling here, that's what I do decide to do, is just because we have so many outs to improve if our opponent does have an overpair. The fact that they bet into two people twice on this board, I think they're going to have a lot of strong jacks in their range, a lot of overpairs, but even if they are bluffing with like a flush draw or something, we do beat them with a 6, and if we get there with either 2-pair trips or a straight, we can bet out for value knowing that our opponent will probably be likely to call a big bet with their overpairs, and that's just a read I have on them because I labelled them as a fun player. So do call, then we get to see the river. It's a beautiful river. We do river 2-pair. Now in this spot I definitely want to go ahead and lead. Even I think my opponent is always going to call a big bet with their overpairs, but with their overpairs, when there's a 4-liner, any 8 makes a straight now, they might be a bit more timid to bet those hands off, and I definitely don't think, even if they do bet off, I don't think they're going to call a check raise. So I just need to lead here to try and win as much as possible. I'll go ahead and bet 23.5, which I think is a bit too small. I think my opponent will call even a bet of like 40 if they do have an overpair, so probably missing a bit of value here when my opponent does have an overpair. My opponent does call, and we take in the pot, so pretty happy to get there on the river and get paid off. I'm going to assume my opponent did have one of the overpairs we don't actually get to see, but happy to take in that pot. So next hand, I'm in +1 with pocket kings. Pretty nice hand to look down at. I go ahead and raise it up to 3, and then I get a bunch of calls, one from a middle position player, one from the small blind, and one from the big blind. So we go 4 ways to a flop. It's a pretty nice flop. Ace, King, 8. When the action checks it over to me, I'm going to go ahead and bet my hand for value here. I really prefer betting out here than check raising, just because we're obviously going to have so many strong hands on this board that when we do start to check raise, I think we could potentially induce hero folds like an ace jack or an ace queen. They're going to know that we have so many ace kings and pocket aces, pocket kings in our range, even pocket 8s, that they're probably going to be pretty easy for them to hero fold those. So I'd rather just keep betting at it, make it look like I could potentially be bluffing with like a jack 10 or something, and just try and build a pot that way. Go ahead and bet 8, and then some good news, the middle position player decides to min raise us to 16. So when the action folds back to me, I decide to just call here. There is obviously merit to 3-betting to try and build a pot against like a, an aforementioned ace jack, or even a stronger hand like an ace king that they didn't 3-bet on pocket 8s or ace 8 suited, for example. The thing is, I think the opponent's just going to bet all of those off on the turn regardless, and like I said about check raising the flop, 3-betting is just as strong, and I think we could potentially induce hero folds, which not looking to do too much, so I don't think I'm going to have a 3-betting range in this spot. I'd rather just call and play a turn. It's the 9 of spades. I go ahead and check it over to the villain. The good news is they keep betting at it, and I think in this spot I'm definitely going to want to go ahead and check raise. We're trying to get stacks in against those stronger aces and 2-pair hands, and we're not going to be able to do that if we don't check raise here. So I go ahead and make it 60, and then the villain decides to call. So that's the good news. Then we heads up to the river, 3 of clubs. Easy, no-brainer decision to rip it all in here, trying to get value from a hand that's like ace jack or stronger. I rip it all in, and then my opponent calls. Loving that news. And then we do get to see that they call with ace 5 offsuit, so stoked to rake in that massive pot there. Next hand, I have pocket 10s in the big blind. We get a hijack open from a player that had actually been playing very tight. They've been playing something like 5-5 after 100 or so hands. So when the action's on me in the big blind, I have a pretty interesting decision whether I want to 3-bet or just call here. Normally I would be 3-betting pocket 10s out of the big blind versus a hijack open, but because my opponent is a bit tighter, I really am going to be somewhat concerned if I 3-bet and I still get action, just because I know my opponent is probably playing pretty tight. I mean, 100 hands, not that large of a sample, but you can definitely start to infer that this opponent is only opening stronger hands. So because of that, I decide to just call with a hand this strong and get to play it post-flop. So we go heads up to the flop. The flop is 9-5-5. I check it over the pre-flop aggressor, and they actually decide to check back. And I think we can start to infer a few things about my opponent's range from this check back, because do have this opponent labelled as a bit tighter, I think it's very, very unlikely that they're going to be checking back a stronger overpair on this board. I think if they did have an overpair, they'd just want to be betting it for value, try and build a pot against a 9. So when they do check back, I think it's somewhat possible that they do have pocket 9s, but other than that, I am very, very confident that I am ahead in this hand. So when the turn is a repeat 9, this is actually a great card because now it's even less likely that my opponent does have pocket 9s. So definitely going to go ahead and bet my hand for value. I decided to bet the size of the pot. That's just because I really think my opponent is going to call this large of a bet with ace king, ace queen, ace jack. I want to build value against those. And I do get a call. So it heads up to the river still. And it is the 8 of diamonds. Pretty big brick for us. So I'm going to keep betting at it. I go ahead and make it 13. Still looking to get called down by an ace high type hand. And then the opponent does call. And we scoop in the pot. So absolutely stoked there. Definitely got called by an ace high hand. And absolutely stoked with that. Next hand I have king 9 hearts in the big blind. A lot of big blind hands tonight. We get an open to 3 from a tight aggressive button, and then a loose passive play in the small blind calls. When the action's on me, I have a pretty standard decision to call here. So we go 3 ways to a flop. It's a banger flop. It is jack 9-9 with 2 clubs. When the small blind checks it over to me, I'm just going to naturally check it over to the pre-flop aggressor. The pre-flop aggressor can have strong jacks, flush draws, overpairs, potentially even worse 9s in their range, and they're going to bet off with most of those when checked too. So looking to mix in a check raise against those hands, but then the button decides to check back. So we see a turn, it's 4 of clubs, puts in the front door flush draw, and then the small blind decides to lead out for 5.5. The action's on me here, and I'll be honest, I'm somewhat concerned that the small blind potentially could have a flush here. They are passive, so they're going to be playing hands like 8-5 of clubs, so they're just going to have a bunch of flushes in their range. There is a bit of hesitancy from me to raise because of that reason. Somewhat concerned I'm behind, but still think I have to raise here. My opponent could have the ace of clubs or even a strong jack that they're leading out, and they're probably going to call a raise with. So trying to get value from those hands, I go ahead and make it 16.5. Button folds, and then the small blind folds as 2, unfortunately. Not sure if that raise was too thin or a good idea on such a wet board, but always curious to hear your input, so hop in the comments below, let me know what you think. Alright, this next one's a doozy. I'm in the big blind again, but this time with pocket queens. We get an early position open to 3, then we get a large 3-bet from a hijack player. They go ahead and make it 12. So when the action's back on me in the big blind, this is kind of already an awkward spot, just because this 3-bet range, that is very, very tight. Not only are they 3-betting an early position open, but they're also doing to 4x. It's indicative of a lot of strength, in my opinion. Having said that, obviously not going to go anywhere with pocket queens pre-flop, and we're not going to be just calling this bet either. Cold calling large 3-bets out of position is going to be a losing play with any type of hands, so going to have to mix in the 4-bet here. I'm mixing in the 4-bet, but I am somewhat concerned that if I do get action going forward, it's probably going to be from a very tight range of hands, so it's definitely can't get too carried away with queens here. Not going to fold though. I mix in the 4-bet. I make it 32, and then here's where things get interesting. The early position player, they decide to call. This is pretty concerning. I definitely think this could be a trap with aces or kings, but also potentially if they did have a hand like pocket jacks or pocket 10s, they might just be undisciplined and deciding to flat it here to try and hit a set type thing, or ace king, same story. So they do to call, and then the 3-better calls as well. So now we're playing a massive 4-bet pot 3 ways. Go heads up to the flop. It is 3-4-4 rainbow. The action's on me here, and I do decide to go ahead and c-bet here. And the reason I'm c-betting is I think if I'm going to get any value from like a pocket jacks, pocket 10s type hand, it's going to be on this straight. And additionally, I'm just like really happy to just deny equity to an ace king or an ace queen type hand, when obviously they're going to have outs to improve and crack my hand here. I just want to get them out and scoop in this already pretty large 4-bet pot here. So that's why I decide to c-bet. I do get a call from an under the gun player, then things get back to the 3-better. They decide to rip it all in, and look, I'm just going to be 100% honest. I am absolutely positive this is always aces or kings. They definitely could have trapped pre-flop when there was so much action. You know, they wouldn't want a 5-bet to potentially induce hero folds with their aces or kings, and now they're just like ripping it in for max value, thinking that worst pocket pairs are always going to call on this board, but we're not going to fall for it here. I think we have a pretty easy fold with our queens. Given that read, given that they're ripping it into two people, like, it's so unlikely that's a bluff when either of us can have aces or kings. So I go ahead and fold it. And then the early position player calls, which is, I'm pretty happy to see, because now we're actually going to get to see what both of them had. Boom. Early position player had aces. They did mix in the trap free flop, and the middle position player had kings. So not sure that we lost the minimum there, but this definitely could have been worse if we didn't make a read that both these players had such a strong range of hands. So to be 100% honest, I'm absolutely stoked that I didn't lose more on this hand. I definitely could have got carried away if I wasn't paying attention or something and able to make this read, but I was able to make it and lose not as much as I would have, so pretty stoked with that. Okay, next hand, I have my favourite hand in all of poker, pocket aces. When we get a limp from a hijack player, definitely going to go ahead and ISO with my favourite hand. I make it 5, and then the limper calls. So we heads up to a flop of Jack 6 deuce rainbow. When the limper checks it over to me here, definitely want to go ahead and bet my overpair for value. In game, I decided to bet 4, which I think that bet size does make a bit of sense on a board texture this dry. Having said that though, I think I am missing value here. My opponent is passive, and I honestly think if they have any one pair hand, they're definitely going to call a larger bet. So if I go ahead and make it like 9 or 10, I think that makes a lot of sense just to try and build a pot. In game though, I bet small, and we do get a call anyway, so it worked out for us at least in this instance. Then the turn is the Queen of Hearts, and here's where things get really interesting. My opponent decides to lead. For the size of the pot, 19.5, obviously a really large bet here, and I think I've talked about on the vlog before about how I think turn leads are typically pretty strong. It's more so like a live poker read that I used to have, but even online, I still think it's strong. My opponent definitely could have slow played a hand like pocket 2s or pocket 6s on such a dry flop, but they also could have turned to pair with Queen Jack. Somewhat concerned I'm behind here, but not going to be folding aces just yet. My opponent definitely could have turned a flush draw, or because I bet so small on the flop, they definitely could have a few open-ended straight draws here, a king 10 or a 10-9, so not going anywhere yet with pocket aces. Having the ace of hearts is actually like makes this the worst ace that I could possibly call with, but still not going anywhere. I throw in the call, and then we get to see a river. It's a pretty interesting one. 6 of hearts, so it does complete the flush draw, but it does counterfeit Queen Jack. And when the opponent does check it over to me, I think if they did river or flush, they probably would have gone ahead and bet it. They could be, checking to induce a bet with a full house, so pocket 2s or, pocket 6s, it's quads, but not too concerned about that. I'm definitely going to go ahead and bet here to try and get value from Queen Jack specifically. I go ahead and bet 33, and then my opponent calls. And then we scoop in the pot, so pretty sure I got called by Queen Jack, or maybe, an Ace Queen type hand that, led turn. Okay, next hand I have pocket 8s in the small blind. We get an open from a loose aggressive player on the button to 2.5. You guys know me, love playing a 3-bet or fold strategy out of the small blind. Hate cold calling out of position in particular, so with a hand as strong as pocket 8s, definitely looking to play it. I go ahead and make it 10. Then the action gets back to the button, and they just like to 4-bet it to 30. The action's back on me here, and I do think pocket 8s has more equity against a loose aggressive player's 4-bet range, just because it's going to have a bunch of stuff like, ace 5 suited, ace 10, as well as, ace king and ace queen, more standard stuff. Having said that though, when my opponent makes it 3x and I'm out of position, I think even against a loose aggressive player, probably better off just folding. Don't want to play this out of position when it's going to cost me so much to see a flop. Awful odds to set mine too, so I think the best play here would be to just fold the pocket 8s. Clearly wasn't feeling that disciplined when I played this hand because I do decide to call. I think it's better because my opponent is a loose aggressive player, but just because it's better doesn't make it good, so definitely should just be folding here. Regardless though, made the mistake and then saw a flop, which was Queen Deuce Deuce. Check it over to the 4-better. Then they decide to c-bet 17. when they see betting so small, and they do have all those hands in their range which we're ahead of that I mentioned pre-flop. Definitely not going to go anywhere with pocket eights. I throw in the call. Then we see a turn, which is the king. Bad card for us. We lose to ace king and king jack now, so I go ahead and check it over to the villain. Then they check back, and I'll be honest, this check back is pretty concerning. I do think if my opponent did turn a king, or they have a strong queen, they definitely could be checking this turn, figuring they're not going to get a lot of action from worse hands. And if they were bluffing with a hand like, ace jack or jack 10 or, ace 5 that they 4-bet pre, like, I think they're definitely going to barrel off on this turn just because they know that we know that it's so good for their range. So definitely going to take a lot of bluffs out of their range when they check back this turn. So when the river's a 9 of spades and we check it over to them again and they do bet, I'm going to go with my read that they definitely do have some type of showdown value and they're going for a bit of value. So I have a pretty easy fold with my pocket eights there. So made the undisciplined play pre-flop and lost 20 more than I really needed to, but didn't want to double down on that mistake by paying off this bet on the river. Okay, we're going to go over one last hand before we get onto the gameplay grade from this session, and this time I have 8-7 of clubs on the button. The action folds round to me and we actually have a poster in the cutoff. They decide to check. So when the action's on me here, I think I probably would be ISOing with 8-7 suited over a limp anyway, but I just want to make note that when you are playing against posts as opposed to limps, it actually makes sense to ISO a bit more just because you're going to get more folds, whereas limp is, typically inclined to limp call bets, whereas posters, when they just check their option, they're more likely to have some trash like 7 deuce or, queen 3 offsuit, so which they're just going to fold when you ISO. So I do think it makes sense to ISO a wider range against posts versus limps, but probably going to raise 8-7 suited regardless whether it's post or a limp. I go ahead and make it 5. And then I get 3-bet by a loose aggressive small blind. The action folds back to me here and I decide to call the 3-bet, which is a play I'm pretty happy with. I don't really want to go ahead and 4-bet here because when I do get action, I'm probably going to beat Crush just because their range will have all the stronger overpairs to my 8s, but this board is going to play really well heads up. We can definitely flop straight draws, flush draws, or pairs that are going to have a lot of equity, even against stronger hands in their range. So I decide to call here and play the pot in position. And then we see a flop of 9-7 deuce, rainbow with backdoor clubs. We do have middle pair and backdoor clubs. The 3-better decides to c-bet half pot. I think we have a pretty easy decision to call here in position. We are very deep with villain and there is implied odds to hitting 2 pair, even against stronger hands in their range. But obviously we're going to be ahead of all the ace-high hands, even at this stage. So pretty easy decision to call in position. Then we see a turn, queen of clubs, pretty good turn for us. We do turn the flush draw, but the villain decides to keep betting at it. They go ahead and bet 53.5, which is a pretty large bet. And in this spot, I'm not going to fold here, obviously with my flush draw and pair, but if my decisions are between calling and raising, I much prefer just calling here. And the reason is, if I do decide to semi-bluff with this hand, I don't think this hand is a pretty good, candidate to semi-bluff with, just because it has so many outs to improve to hands that beat overpairs. But in this specific instance, at this step depth against my opponent's range of hands, if I just rip it all in here, I'm only going to get called by hands that are like a strong queen or better. Like, I do not have fold equity against aces when we are this shallow with villain. But if I do call here and I do get there on the river, I think I'm pretty likely to stack those hands anyway. Like, when the pot's this big and I rip it all in, like, they're probably not going to fold for 120 more. So this is just sort of like a really good opportunity for us to just call, because I do think there are implied odds to hitting 2 pair trips or a flush on the river. And the other thing is, if my opponent is continuing to bluff with like, an ace X type hand, we're actually ahead of that already, so we do have a bit of showdown value with our pair as well. So I make the decision to just call here. Then we see a river, which is the 4 of spades, so we do miss everything, unfortunately. But fortunately, the villain does decide to check. I have a pretty easy decision to check back here. I'm glad I did, because my opponent had ace high, and we actually scoop in this pot with middle pair. So pretty nice hand to end it on. We pull in a big pot with a pretty middling strength hand. So those were the most interesting hands that I played across the course of this session. definitely a mix of good plays and definitely some mistakes as well that I made over the course of the session. But overall, I'm going to have to give my gameplay grade a B for today. I was happy with a lot of the plays I did make, specifically that pocket queen's hand where I was able to get away from it because I was focused and paying attention. Fortunately, wasn't fully dialed in and 100% for all of the sessions. A few calls that were a bit too loose, namely the pocket eights, and when I called with the gut shot on the flop, they were too loose, and I'm definitely losing EV with those plays, and that's just from a lack of discipline and focus. So definitely can't go to that A grade level when I did make those few mistakes, but not going to be too harsh either when I did make some good plays that did get me a lot of EV across the session. So going to go with that B. That's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Apologies again for the long wait between vlogs, but hopefully this is the one that comes out good and you all enjoyed watching it. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and leave a thumbs up. For now, I'm out of here. Peace.